In this video we're going to take a look at the water or hydrologic cycle. And so we can see here a lot of things going on. We have evaporation from the oceans, evaporation from streams and creeks. We have precipitation and infiltration when the water that lands on the ground goes into the soil and becomes part of the groundwater. We have extraction, where humans are bringing groundwater up from the ground using wells, and then for human use. And when we get precipitation, if we don't get infiltration, then we're going to get runoff, and that's where it's running along the surface into the eventually leading to the oceans. And one that's probably new to you is transpiration. This would be the water vapor being given off by the leaves of vegetation. And we have uptake, where water is being brought from the roots of the plants into the plant itself, and then ultimately passing out by transpiration. So there's a lot going on here, but we can see that water is present both in the oceans and waterways, as well as the atmosphere, and also in the groundwater. So one thing I want to point out here is this terminology, aquifer. That refers to the rock layer within the earth that can hold water. So think of it as rocks with some pore spaces between them, and the water can stay in or be held in those pores. And the top level of that aquifer is referred to as the water table. So it's, in other words, is how high does the water come up. And the whole presence of the water there we refer to as groundwater. So here's some specific things about the hydrologic cycle: that water enters the atmosphere by evaporation and by transpiration from leaves. It condenses and falls from the sky as precipitation. It flows as runoff from the land surface into streams, rivers, lakes, and eventually the ocean. And water infiltrates into aquifers, becoming groundwater, the upper limit of which is the water table. There are several human impacts on the hydrologic cycle. Here are a few. Number one is diverting river water for crop irrigation reduces the flow downstream, and this is reducing fish and amphibian populations in riparian or river vegetation, especially for bugs and birds. We also get over-extraction or overdrafting of water, especially for agriculture, and this can deplete groundwater and increases evaporation. We also pave our roads, our parking lots, and our buildings, and this increases runoff and reduces infiltration, slowing the rate of groundwater recharge. Around our roads here we see sewer drains, where the water flowing along the road are going to pass into that, and then it's going to go along underwater pipes into the river, into the ocean, or into the nearest creek, and then from there into the ocean. So what is better for groundwater is to allow that water to flow into an area that has soil, and from there, if you can design it where that water sits for a while, then it has a chance to soak into the ground, and therefore recharging the aquifer. What that means is putting the water back into the aquifer. And also we have deforestation here, number 4, which increases surface runoff and erosion, therefore decreasing infiltration. And you also have damming of rivers, which increases evaporation and infiltration locally, but decreases it elsewhere. So you think about a place like Lake Achuma, where you had that river that would have flowed from the Santa Ynez River out to sea. Now that water sitting in Lake Achuma is going to be evaporating, and that water is no longer going downstream. So here's a big one that I'll just mention now. We'll return to this in our unit on water. Over-extraction in coastal areas leads to saltwater intrusion, and Santa Barbara area is prone to this. So this is not good. As we're pulling water out of the ground from a well, we get what's called a cone of depression, where the water table dips down around it. And if that water table dips too low, you can actually get what's called saltwater intrusion. Saltwater from the ground, or saltwater that's salty groundwater near the coast, can then go into your freshwater groundwater. And so now what you're pumping out with your well is water that contains salt, which is really useless for human consumption and also for irrigation. And so what's the solution? At that point, you pretty much need to drill a new well farther away from the coast or desalinate the water, which is very expensive. So that's a little intro to the hydrologic cycle. Let's talk about plate tectonics. This is the process by which plates of crust move across Earth's surface and atop its malleable mantle and molten core. So they actually are moving. You can think of this as solid rock floating on top of molten lava or molten core. And over millions of years, continents change position. The movement is slow. It's only about 2 to 15 centimeters or 1 to 6 inches per year. And plate tectonics underlies earthquakes and volcanoes. So we're going to take a look at 3 different types of boundaries when different plates come together. One is called a transform fault boundary, or and what you see here is a strike slip fault. So this is where they shift sideways. And earthquakes occur at transform boundaries where plates slip alongside each other. A classic example that we see here in Southern California is the San Andreas Fault. And so this is an image. This kind of runs through the desert area behind LA and further up into California. So what we see here on the left side is one large plate tectonic that extends all the way underneath the Pacific Ocean. And this other plate tectonic is going eastward into the rest of our country. So you get a sort of like a scarring effect. As these slide, you get rocks breaking up and a lot of seismic activity. So another kind of boundary is called a divergent plate boundary. And this is where the two plates are separating. And when they separate, what comes in to take the place is magma. And when it comes to the surface, it begins to cool. And this is called a rift. And as it's cooling, it's forming a ridge. And so what are some other words we see here? Oceanic crust, magma is what's flowing up. So magma seeps up beneath the ocean at divergent boundaries, bringing new minerals and habitat for pioneer species. So this is a really big idea, that this is one way that minerals can get introduced into ecosystems for all the living organisms to use. It's from this rock coming up to the surface. And this is also now new habitat. It's rock, so there's absolutely no soil there. You need pioneer species to come in and begin to form soil on that. And even right now, Hawaii is constantly growing from the flow of lava. And in many places around Hawaii, you have soil, but at one point it was just rock, and that soil has taken hundreds of years or longer to form. So one of these classic divergent plate boundaries is seen along the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's called the mid-oceanic ridge, and it's where they're pulling apart. And when we look down at the surface of these, we can see some different vents. And so here's a place where volcanic gases are coming out of the ridge. These gases are typically very high in sulfur, and you actually get some very unusual life forms in these kind of habitats. One type of life form is called, they do a process called chemosynthesis. So not photosynthesis, because this is far too deep for any sunlight to reach, but they're synthesizing energy from the chemicals that are present, the hydrogen sulfide chemicals coming out of these vents. So a little question for you here. What type of tectonic plate boundary is most responsible for volcanic transformation? Volcanic formation. Actually, let's see here. Should we do that now? Sure. So what do you think is the best answer? Alright, if you said convergent plate boundary, that is correct. Let's take a look at how that happens. So in a convergent plate boundary, the plates are actually sliding into each other. And when that happens, one plate slides underneath the other plate, and when it does, the rock begins to melt and turning into magma. And usually the plate that's going over the other one is kind of thin, so this magma is able to come up and seep through that thinner crust. And that's where we see a lot of volcanoes being formed. And what happens between them is a trench. We can also have a situation where they push against each other, but one does not go underneath the other. And this is when we have something called uplift happening, and this can form mountains. And also it helps bring minerals to the surface, because rock that was formerly not exposed to the air or to the surface becomes exposed. And I want to say one other thing here. You should know this word subduction, and sub meaning going underneath. So that's what we get in this example of a convergent plate boundary. We can see here an outline of the major tectonic plates of the world. And here is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge that I was showing you. That's this one coming along here. The San Andreas Fault runs right along the western coastline. And we can see that at some point here, according to plate tectonic theory, all these continents were connected in something called Pangaea. And that would have been a long time ago, 225 million years ago, around the time of dinosaurs. And what accounts for the formation of the Hawaiian Islands? So you go ahead and hit pause and see if you can figure this one out. Alright, so if you said an area in the middle of a tectonic plate called a hotspot, where magma comes through coupled with continental drift, this is true. So let's take a look at that process here. So here is a hotspot, which is just like a thin weak spot in the Earth's crust where hot mantle can break through. And what we see here is the Hawaiian chain, which is actually a very long chain of volcanoes. The only ones that we see are the ones that actually stick above the ocean water. And this whole string is evidence of the plate, the Pacific tectonic plate, moving. So the hotspot stays in the same place, but the plate is moving. Let me say that differently. The hotspot on the plate is moving with the plate. And so wherever that hotspot is at that time, that's where you get volcanoes forming. And so you can see here the direction of the plate motion. Right now, currently, Hawaii is the active part. This is where new magma is coming out. And then you have Maui and Molokai and Oahu and Kauai. So here's a good illustration of that ring of fire. So this entire Pacific plate is one plate tectonic, or one tectonic plate. And as it's shifting, sliding against other tectonic plates, or doing subduction, going underneath them, any kind of movement is where you get earthquakes. And so that's what we see with all these red dots. And they call this the ring of fire because whenever you have these plates come together, you have more volcanoes at that place. So this particular volcano, this would be Mount Shasta up in Northern California, and then you have some other ones, Mount St. Helens up here in Washington, and then some up in Canada. And a lot of earthquakes, as we know, in Japan, where the earthquake of Fukushima, it caused the nuclear reactor to melt down. And yeah, so there's a lot of geologic activity along that border. So let's finish up here with a brief discussion about the rock cycle. What is the type of rock most likely found in Hawaii? So I'm going to save these questions. I'm going to save these questions for in class. So here's the rock cycle. We have igneous rock, sedimentary rock, and metamorphic rock. Which of these is the youngest type? So you have to say igneous rock because it's the one that comes out that directly cools from the lava, and so it can be weathered and eroded, so that it's breaking apart into smaller pieces called sediments. And when these sediments come together and form layers, under the right conditions, they can undergo what's called lithification, where these layers become cemented to each other, and now you have new rock called sedimentary rock. And this sedimentary rock can then get buried underneath more sedimentary rock as more and more layers of sediment form, usually in the ocean. And the heat and pressure applied can cause changes to the elements in that rock, and you can get metamorphic rock. So one classic example of this would be coal. When you apply heat and pressure to it, that coal can become diamond, and so it changes form. And that's what we call metamorphic. And as this metamorphic rock goes deeper, it can experience melting into magma and then cooling into new igneous rock. So this truly is a cycle, and it can go many different ways. This igneous rock can also become metamorphic rock, which can also erode into sediments, and those sediments can deposit and form sedimentary rock. And This is so some things we should know here. Igneous rock is of volcanic origin. It's cooled magma that may flow across Earth's surface as lava. And sedimentary rock is mineralized sediments, layers of mud, dust, or sand formed by lithification. And metamorphic rock means transformed by extreme heat or pressure. Alright, so there's a little intro. Talk to you in class.